Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we made it. Tonight is the scariest night of the year. Happy Halloween, everyone. Let's dive into an assortment of terrifying Halloween tales to end this most festive of holidays in the creepiest way possible. Always check your children's Halloween candy. Always. I'm not saying this to fearmonger. And then to tell you the truth, I realize that most of the candy handed out on the holiday is likely purchased at Walmart the day before and shoved into a plastic, pumpkin-shaped bowl. You probably have realized that most sane people don't poison candy, or put glass in it, or whatever cautionary urban legend you've heard. The only guy who did do that did so to his own son. So those neighbors of yours, don't treat them like criminals. They're just trying to innocently give the kiddos some sweets. This warning regards a phenomenon that has no apparent origin. Well, what I mean is, no one is really sure of where it comes from. The candy in question isn't even so. You can't purchase it at any stores, and looking it up online results in no results. The candy, this aforementioned phenomenon, appears to be that of a cinnamon jawbreaker, not to be confused with the Atomic Fireball brand or any other similar sweet. It may resemble a red-tinted gumball or a red lollipop with no stick. The point being, it's rather generic in appearance, which makes it tricky to spot the real deal. The candy is sometimes branded under the HH Sweets Company, a corporation that doesn't exist, at least not one registered by any agency since 1999. If you search the internet, you might find some HH Sweets businesses, but I assure you, they aren't the real deal. Merely a namesake coincidence. If the label carries the HH name, beneath it, a tagline will read something to the effect of hot as hell, sweet as heaven. Not all of the candies sport the branding, but it certainly helps to spot it. This is why I advise, if you find yourself, or your kids, with an unmarked red candy, the safest bet is to throw the sucker away. Documentation of the phenomenon only dates back to 2007, but there is the possibility that it's gone on for far longer. As of this recording, a known 9 people have ingested the candy, 4 of which being children under the age of 18. Each case has happened on October 31st, with the most cases occurring during 2016, with a total of 3 victims. The only clues as to the candy's appearance and branding is through the eyes of witnesses, and subsequent investigations of any nearby and open candy wrappers. Each of the victims' corpses, aside from the heads, remain untouched. The heads, however, are where things get strange. Each of the heads is completely burnt, like a used match. This would make identification of the victims troublesome, except for the fact that fingerprint analysis lent itself fittingly to the nature of these deaths, considering the hands of the deceased were completely intact. None of the victims were related in any way, with the only exception being a father and his 9-year-old daughter, Andy and Mary Kay Winfield from Lexington, Virginia. All of the others shared no relation, other than the aforementioned candy. An eyewitness report from Brevard, North Carolina, documented the full story behind the mysterious death of a 12-year-old boy, Shane Davis, who died on the Halloween of 2009. I was leaving the pharmacy around 8:30 when it happened. He, Davis, was walking down the block in a zombie costume. I didn't even notice him at first because it was dark and the costume was dark. But then there was this flash of orange light, like someone lighting a candle. I turned around and this heat wave hit me in the face, and the smell, oh Lord, it smelled like cooked meat. His head was on fire. There were people screaming, but there was nothing we could do. He screamed for only a moment, and then he hit the pavement. I'll never unsee it. There were rumors it was a hex from a witch or something. I'm not a superstitious man, but when you see something like that, superstition doesn't seem too far off, you know? Similar reports were documented for many of the other victims. Shortly after ingesting the candy, the victim's head would burst into flames, and soon thereafter the victim would succumb to the injury and die. Many rumors and theories have since popped up surrounding the deaths and candy. Many include witches and spells, but some have garnered significant following beyond regional folklore. One of the most popular rumors cites the deaths as a result of the 1782 execution of Henry Hyson Cassidy, H.H. Cassidy, a candy maker from Ononcock, Virginia, the site of the first documented death from 2007. Cassidy, a local candy maker, was placed on trial for the disappearances of 2 young girls from the neighboring town. Despite having no apparent motive for abducting the 2 young girls, the candy maker was charged as a reasonable suspect, having access to sweets for alluring the children. Following a local investigation where one of the girls' bodies was discovered with candy in her pocket, Cassidy was charged with the murders and sentenced to death. Children from the town, who once loved the sweets made by the candy maker, began calling Cassidy the Witch of Ononcock, making him one of the earliest male witches of legend. Being found guilty in a hasty trial, Cassidy was sentenced to death by molten metal, a process considered barbaric, except in the case of an accused witch. Cassidy, who swore his innocence until his death, had a molten metal ball dropped into his throat. While a quick death, it was certainly not painless. The townsfolk remarked that justice was served on that day, and the body was buried in a shallow grave. Given that Andy and Mary Kay Winfield were also from Virginia, many speculated that the spirit of Cassidy returned to punish those responsible for his death, using his signature candy as a way to torment the descendants of his accusers. The name, too, H.H. Cassidy, would explain the name on the wrappers, H.H. Sweets. Another popular theory is usually referred to as the jack-o'-lantern story. Based on the Irish myth, the story goes that a man known as Stingy Jack tricked the devil on multiple occasions, resulting in his banishment from hell, as well as heaven, as he was a trickster at heart. The man, forced to roam the earth, lit coal within a turnip, and has been using it ever since to light his eternal path. The story, clearly rooted in the Halloween tradition of carving jack-o'-lanterns, has been used to explain the candy too. Stingy Jack, as he's referred, seeks out souls to join him in his eternal punishment. The candy, which burns the heads of its consumers, turns them into a somewhat crude jack-o'-lantern. This would explain the fiery demise of the victims, as well as its connection to the celebration of Halloween. In conjunction with the Stingy Jack narrative, there are some who conclude the candy is the work of the devil himself, tormenting unsuspecting holiday celebrators with death merely for the fun of it. A rather sick trick, yes, but then again, mischief is commonplace in the celebration of Halloween. As for this theory, the HH label would stand for Hell's Hottest or some other variation of the Hell alliteration. Despite these varying backstories to the candy, there is a far more grounded explanation that many have subscribed to. Rather than reading into the HH Sweets mythology, some conclude that HH Sweets is precisely what it claims to be, a candy company. The motive for committing these crimes is at large still a mystery, but this theory cuts out the claims of ghosts and devils, suggesting instead that a select few sickos had the willpower to conjure up sweets with the intent to kill. In the end, no one theory is correct, at least not one that can be confirmed by traditional means. A candy that is, for lack of a better term, supernatural can only be explained by the supernatural, making it extremely difficult to verify any of the information regarding it. If you wish to avoid the grisly results of the candy, it is advised to always check your children's Halloween candy. Better yet, avoid the trick-or-treating tradition altogether. Or, if you're highly concerned, perhaps it would be best to simply skip Halloween altogether. Some say on Halloween night, if you go past 7 black gates, you will see the 7 gates of hell. I thought it was a myth at first, until I tried it out. I went past 7 black gates around my neighborhood, and then I went to sleep. My dreams were of a furious fire. Then the fire stopped. There was a man, tall and bulky. His eyes were squinted. Must have been old. His legs and hands were thin, and he looked like he could barely support his own weight. He spoke. He spoke with a scratchy and dying tone. He said something in reverse. "Welcome to the 7 gates of hell." He chuckled and opened the gate. My whole body became numb. Moving on its own, I couldn't fight it. Struggling didn't work, and eventually I gave up trying to fight it. Without my own control, I went past the first gate. Gate 1. I saw a fire. Corpses that were horribly mutilated, desecrated, and burnt. They were sobbing so loudly that I couldn't hear the crackles of the fire. One came to me. It had one eye and bullet holes all over it. He said, "We are the desecrated corpses who did not get a proper burial. We are here to stay until Judgment Day." I went past him to the second gate. It was in a building. A dungeon. There were people tied up, screaming in pain. One was being sawed in half very slowly, and his body kept healing, ready to be sawed again. One was in the Iron Maiden, with the door being closed and opened, and the body looked as normal as ever. A man in an executioner's mask said to me, "We are the torturer tortured by our own devices." I went past him to the exit. I walked to the third gate. This time, I was in a forest. It was silent except for a few yells. There was a man hanging from a noose. Another fell off a cliff, reappeared, and fell off again. I was running away from what I thought looked like a horribly burnt woman chasing after me. I already knew what this place was. These were the people that committed suicide. I ran into the fourth gate. It was in a palace. I was in there, and I saw emperors and politicians and really wealthy people. An emperor was being gnawed on by lions. When the lion ripped a limb off or slashed him, the part grew back. A politician was being beaten by what looked like shadows in prisoner's clothing. A man in a suit came to me and said, "We are the corrupted people. The people who used our power to help ourselves, not the people." I walked to the next gate, the fifth. It was another room. There was a man tied up on a bed, lashed by a floating, spiky leather whip. A woman was being burnt by a lighter, but her screams and cries were muffled by a cloth used as a gag. A rather large man came up to me and said, "We are the rapists and the sex offenders paying for our crimes on Earth." I ran to the sixth gate. I was in a room again. I saw a man and a woman being stabbed, their wounds healing almost immediately. Another person was being buried alive, and another being hit and jabbed with a floating metal bar. I knew who these were. They were the people who were murderers, being harmed by the way they had killed their victims. The exit was the seventh gate, the final one. The nightmare is almost over. It's almost over, I said to myself. Now I was outside. There was a man wearing a shroud over his head, coated with explosives. He blew up, regenerated, and blew up again. Another was being beaten, stabbed by sharp metal objects, and burned by torches, lighters, and matches. They were held by people who looked like shadows. One of them came to me and said, "They are the mass murderers, the terrorists, suicide bombers. I am a shadow of one of his victims, beating him and taking revenge for killing us on Earth." I ran to the exit. When I woke up in the morning, I became horribly scared. The images of what I saw ran through my head. In fact, that's all I could think about for the entire year. It became Halloween again. I didn't dare to go outside. I just went to bed. It took me a while to sleep. But when I did, I was back in front of the first gate of hell. There was a teenager like me. He was just staring at me, shocked to see me. My body was numb. I couldn't control myself again. I said to him in a scratchy, dying tone, "Welcome to the 7 gates of hell." I chuckled and opened the gate for him. After he went inside with an expression that looked like he was fighting something and struggling, I looked at myself on a goblet filled with what looked like blood. I saw the gatekeeper. I became the gatekeeper. In fact, I am the gatekeeper. Greywater Gardens lives up to its name, I thought, as I made my way up the damp concrete slabs, bridging across the stagnant pond. Everywhere leading up to the ash and decrepit house was lined by rotting flowers and the congealed feces of cats, dogs, and other animals. The water itself looked like it had remained the same for centuries. This place is dead. As dead as I am. I arrived at the door, more of a collection of damp splinters, and hesitantly pushed it open, causing the hinges to shriek. No more shrieking, please. The inside was as drab and oppressive as the outside, and my nostrils filled with the sense of mold and neglect and regret. Or maybe it's just me. I hadn't showered in days. I couldn't face the water. There was what appeared to be some kind of waiting area, 3 or 4 old wickered chairs, and one of those "please be seated" signs you find in posh restaurants. So, looking around for the slightest bit of human company, I sat down and waited. Despite myself, my wallet found its way into my hands, and then the picture of M I kept in there found its way in front of my eyes. I could never throw this away, no matter how many times I told myself to, for the sake of my own sanity. But I couldn't. This was all I had left of her fair white skin and pale blue eyes and ginger hair I'd tease about her, and the freckles on her face and chest. She was beautiful. I tried to correct myself to present tense, but I couldn't. I'd never forget the day the last of that ginger hair fell out. A cough brought me back to reality, and I looked, blinking back tears, to see an old man, bald and bearded, and stooped over, grinning through a mouth of yellow teeth. His clothes were as gray and wiry as the hairs on his face, like he was Greywater Gardens in human form. Even his right eye was gray. The left was just a black, empty socket with the eyelids hanging over it forlornly. "You have an appointment?" He spoke like he hadn't used his voice in years. "Yes, I have a secret. I want to deposit it." "I know you do," he said. He let me grasp at words, wondering how the hell he knew, when he said, "You wouldn't be here for any other reason, would you?" He turned and beckoned me to follow him into the back room. I gazed at the picture of M one last time. "I love you." Then I slid it back into my wallet and did as I was bid. The room was more of the same, gray and wet and rotting and horrid. The only remarkable feature was the huge, hefty ledger on an antique wooden table, next to a plain steel chalice. And in the middle of the room was a concrete pool, only a few feet across, filled with the same stagnant gray water from the ponds outside. The old man opened the ledger. "Do you wish to deposit a secret?" he asked, perhaps as a formality. Or maybe he's playing with me. "Yes," I said. "Your name?" I told him. "Excellent. Then let's begin." He picked up the chalice and moved to the pool. He bent down, agonizingly slow, but eventually he filled the cup and shuffled over to me. "Drink the water," he told me, a grin playing upon his old and papery lips as he pushed the cup into my hand. "The water will enter you, and your secret will replace it in the water. No man can discern its murky depths." His smile was so wide, I thought his face might crack open. "But be warned, once I have taken custody of your secret, you can never reveal it. No one will ever know. but there will be no competence or confession or chance of redemption. Are you sure this is the path you wish to take?" "I am." I didn't even hesitate. "No one can know, for both of our sakes." The old man shrugged and took a step back. I raised the cold steel to my face, but before I could drink, curiosity gripped me. "Why do you take other people's secrets?" "In the world of the blind," he laughed, raspy and throaty, and tapped at his missing eye. "The man with one eye is king." And I knew exactly what he meant. "For you, Em," I thought, as I downed my morbid toast. I dropped the chalice and left without a word, knowing now that she was safe. As I walked out of Greywater Gardens, I looked down at the putrid pond and remembered. It wasn't the water that was gray at all, but her face, as I held her frail body down in the bath. In the last decade and a half, it's become indefinitely easier to obtain exactly what you're looking for, by way of a couple of keystrokes. The internet has made it all too simple to use a computer to change reality. An abundance of information is merely a search engine away, to the point where it's hard to imagine life as any different. Yet, a generation ago, when the words streaming and torrent were meaningless, save for conversations about water, people met face-to-face to conduct software swap parties, trading games and applications on Sharpie-labeled 5¼ inch floppies. Of course, most of the time, the meets were a way for frugal, community-minded individuals to trade popular games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion among themselves. However, a few early programming talents designed their own computer games to share among their circle of acquaintances, who in turn would pass it on until, if fun and well-designed enough, an independently developed game had its place in the collection of aficionados across the country. Think of it as the 80s equivalent of a viral video. Pale Luna, on the other hand, was never circulated outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that ever run the game, now buried under layers of filth and polyestrin. This fact is attributed to a number of rather abstruse design choices made by its programmer. Pale Luna was a text adventure in the vein of Zork and the Lurking Horror, at a time when said genre was swiftly going out of fashion. Upon booting the program, the player was presented with a screen almost completely blank, except for the text. You are in a dark room. Moonlight shines through the window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and a rope. There is a door to the east. Command? So began the game that one writer for a long out-of-print fanzine decried as enigmatic, nonsensical, and completely unplayable, as the only commands that the game would accept were pick up gold, pick up shovel, pick up rope, open door, and go east. The player was soon presented with the following. Reap your reward. Pale Luna smiles at you. You are in a forest. There are paths to the north, west, and east. Command? What quickly infuriated the few who played the game was the confusing and buggy nature of the second screen onward. Only one of the directional decisions would be the correct one. For example, on this occasion, a command to go in a direction other than north would lead to the system freezing, requiring the operator to hard reboot the entire computer. Further, Any subsequent screens seem to merely repeat the above text, with the difference being only the directions available. Worse still, the standard text adventure commands appeared to be useless. The only accepted non-movement related prompts were use gold, which caused the game to display the message, not here. Use shovel, which brought up, not now. And use rope, which prompted the text, you've already used this. Most who've played the game progressed a couple of screens into it before becoming fed up by having to constantly reboot and tossing the disc in disgust, writing off the experience as a shoddy programmed farce. However, there is one thing about the world of computers that remains true, no matter the era. Some people who use them have way too much time on their hands. A young man by the name of Michael Nevins decided to see if there was more to Pale Luna than that which met the eye. 5 hours and 33 screens worth of trial and error and unplugged computer cords later, he finally managed to make the game display different text. The text in this new area read, Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here. Command. It was another hour still before Nevin stumbled upon the proper combination of phrases to make the game progress any further. Dig hole, drop gold, then fill hole. This caused the screen to display, congratulations, followed by coordinates, upon which the game ceased to accept commands, requiring the user to reboot one last time. After some deliberation, Nevins came to the conclusion that those numbers, those coordinates, were latitude and longitude, leading to a point in the sprawling forest dominated by the nearby volcanic park. As he possessed much more free time than sense, Nevins vowed to see Pale Luna through to its ending. The next day, armed with a map, a compass, and a shovel, he navigated the park's trails, noting the amusement how each turn he made corresponded roughly to those that he took in the game. Though he initially regretted bringing the cumbersome digging tool on a mere hunch, the path's similarity all but confirmed his suspicions that the journey would end with him face to face to the eccentric buried treasure. Out of breath after a tricky struggle to the coordinates, he was pleasantly surprised by a literal stumble upon a patch of uneven dirt. Shoveling as excitedly as he was, it would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when his heavy strokes unearthed the badly decomposing head of a blonde-haired little girl. Nevins promptly reported the situation to the authorities. The girl was identified as Karen Paulson, 11, reported as missing in the San Diego Police Department a year and a half prior. Efforts were made to track down the programmer of Pale Luna, but the newly anonymous legal gray area in which the software swapping community operated inescapably led to many dead ends. Collectors have been known to offer up upwards of 6 figures for an authentic copy of the game. The rest of Karen's body was never found. Sometime during the night of August 16th, 1952, the small town of Ashley, Kansas, ceased to exist. At 3:28 a.m. on August 17th, 1952, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The earthquake itself was felt throughout the state and most of the Midwest. The epicenter was determined to be directly under Ashley, Kansas. When state law enforcement arrived at what should have been the outskirts of the farming community, They found a smoldering, burning fissure in the earth measuring 1,000 yards in length and approximately 500 yards in width. The depth of the fissure was never determined. After 12 days, the statewide and local search for the missing 679 residents of Ashley, Kansas, was called off by the Kansas state government at 9:15 p.m. on the night of August 29th, 1952. All 679 residents were assumed to be dead. At 2:27 a.m. on August 30th, 1952, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The epicenter was centered under what used to be the location of Ashley, Kansas. When law enforcement investigated at 5:32 a.m., they reported that the fissure in the earth had closed. In the 8 days leading up to the disappearance of the town and its 679 residents, bizarre and unexplainable events were reported by dozens of residents in Ashley, Kansas, and law enforcement from the surrounding area. On the evening of August 8th, 1952, at 7:13 p.m., a resident by the name of Gabriel Jonathan reported a strange sight in the sky above Ashley. The town itself, having no official branch of law enforcement, called into the station of the neighboring towns of Hayes. Gabriel reported what appeared to be a small black opening in the sky. Within the next 15 minutes, the Hayes police station became overwhelmed with dozens of phone calls, all reporting the same phenomenon. The phenomenon was never reported by any neighboring communities. A decision was made to send a trooper to Ashley to investigate the matter the following morning. At 7:54 a.m. on the morning of August 9th, 1952, Hayes police officer Alathan Mace radioed the Hayes police station. He reported that, despite following the one-way road leading to Ashley, he had become lost. According to his report, the road continued along its normal path, but somehow ended up back in Hayes. Officer Mace went on to add that the road never curved or bent in any direction. At 9:15 a.m., 7 of the town's 10 police cars were sent to investigate the situation, and all members of the team came back to the same conclusion. The only road leading into Ashley stopped leading into Ashley, but instead led back into Hayes. Phone calls continued to pour into the Hayes police station, all reporting that the black opening in the sky continued to grow in size. All callers were advised to remain inside and to not travel outside unless absolutely necessary. At 8:17 p.m., Mrs. Elaine Cantor reported her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Milton, and their 2 children, Jeffrey and Brooke, missing. According to Mrs. Cantor's phone call, the Miltons attempted to leave town in their family car earlier in the evening. They never returned. Law enforcement officials from Hayes never reported the car or individuals coming up the one-way road. At 7:38 a.m. on the morning of August 10th, 1952, phone calls from Ashley into the Hayes police station reported that the town was in total darkness. The sun had never risen. At 10:15 a.m., at the request of Hayes law enforcement, a helicopter from Topeka, Kansas, flew over the region in which Ashley, Kansas stood. The town was never observed from the air. At 12:43 p.m., on the afternoon of August 11th, Mrs. Phoebe Denwelski called into the Hayes police station. She reported that her daughter, Erica, had begun to have conversations with her father, who died 3 years prior in a drunk driving accident. To add to her concern, Mrs. Danwelski reported that Erica was attempting to go outside into the dark to join them. Over the course of the next 12 hours, a reported 329 phone calls were placed into the Hayes police station, all describing similar phenomenon with the children of the town. The following morning of August 12th, 1952, the situation became dire. During the middle of the night, all 217 children in the town of Ashley, Kansas, disappeared. A reported 421 phone calls were placed into the Hayes Police Department. Unable to be of any useful assistance, Hayes law enforcement instructed all callers to remain inside and to avoid any and all attempts at finding the missing children. At 5:19 p.m. on the evening of August 13th, Ashley elderly man Scott Luntz reported a growing, distant fire to the south. According to his description, the fire seemed to turn the distant black into bright red and orange that seemed to extend high into the sky. Throughout the rest of the day, calls continued in, stating that the fire, in addition to moving north, now seemed to come out of the black sky. No fire was ever witnessed by any of the neighboring communities or law enforcement officials. The reports continued until 12:09 a.m. on the morning of August 14th. The last phone call, placed by a Mr. Benjamin Endicott, reported that the fire in the sky had grown so intense that it began to appear as daytime over the town. The phone call ended abruptly. Just hold on, wait. Yeah, I see something. It's to the south. It looks like... The next phone call wouldn't be placed until the following evening. The following is the entire transcript of the final phone call to be received by the Hayes Police Department out of the town of Ashley, Kansas. It was placed at 9:46 p.m. on the evening of August 15th. In this recorded phone call, the officer on duty is Officer Peter Welsh. The caller has been identified as Mrs. April Foster. Hayes Police Department. Hello? Yes, hello. Ma'am, who am I speaking with? My name is April Foster. Please, sir, please help me. What's happening, ma'am? Last night they came back. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to... Last night they came back! Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down and speak clearly. What happened? Who came back? Everyone. Everyone? They all came in the fire. What do you mean, everyone? My son. I saw my son last night. He was walking down the street. He was burned. Ma'am, he died last year. I raised him since he was a baby. It was just me and him. I told him to watch for cars when he rode his bike, but he never wanted to listen. Ma'am, what you're saying isn't making any sense. You said everyone came back? Are you listening to me? Everyone came back. Everyone who died or went missing, they're back and they're looking for us. He said, Mommy, I'm okay now. See, I can walk again. Where are you, Mommy? I want to see you. Ma'am, where are you now? Are you safe? I'm hiding. Just like everyone else, we saw them coming through the fields, and some people opened their doors for them, screaming. I don't know what happened to them, but their houses caught fire and they caved in. I have my curtains drawn. I'm hiding in the closet right now and... Ma'am, is everything all right? Are you okay? Ma'am? Oh my God. Ma'am? Something just came in. Ma'am? Stay as quiet as you can. Don't make a sound. Mommy. Mommy. He came inside. Stay absolutely still. Don't leave. Mommy. Where are you hiding? Stay quiet. I found you, Mommy. I found you! Ah! Ma'am. Ma'am. The following morning, at 6:55 a.m., the law enforcement officials of the Hayes Police Department arrived at the location of Ashley, Kansas. A smoldering, burning fissure in the earth was all that remained. Have you ever had an experience that suggested someone else was in your house and just thought, I don't want to know, and left it? Sometimes fear of the unknown just seems like the preferable option than facing the real concrete danger. Normally it's nothing, though. One time, the beeper function of my wireless house phone went off when I was the only one home. It could only be called from the living room. Another time, I swear someone took the change from my desk. They're all probably just slightly disconcerting tricks of the memory. But what would you do when something truly suggestive happens? Would you run, or just ignore it like I did? Last Monday was a normal day. I got up, brushed my teeth, and changed into school clothes. All little parts of my morning ritual. It seemed like it would be just another totally unnoteworthy day, until I saw the strings. There were 3 or 4 thick twine strings in my room. They crisscrossed between the walls around my bed, one attached to the door. No way would I have missed them before. I should have tripped over them. They were tied to pins in the walls, which had also not existed before 10 seconds ago. Nobody could have been in my room while I was in it, let alone set this up. It was too early, and my brain wasn't processing correctly. I simply discredited the sight, untied the strings, and left for school, leaving them balled up on my desk. It didn't get any better later. Outside my house, there were hundreds of them, tied between houses, around cars, across streets. This had to be some super elaborate prank. One of those hidden camera shows or comedy improv blogs. They had gotten everyone else to play along too. Passers-by were tangled in them, tying them to objects they were walking towards and away from, as if they had been and were continuing to follow the course laid out for them. I nervously continued on my journey to school. On the bus, everyone except me was tied to the door. At school, groups of friends were tied to each other. Teachers were tied to their desks and boards. Oddly enough, at this point all I could wonder was why I had been left out. When my friend Lucy sat beside me in first period, she simply plunked her bag down on my lap and rested her chin in her hand, looking right past me to the window outside. "Hey, Lucy." No response. "Come on, I didn't expect you to be in on this too." She sighed and started taking books from her bag. All of the books were tied to her hands. I grinned and yanked one of the strings off of a book. She didn't seem to notice, instead simply disregarding the book completely. letting it drop to the floor without a moment's hesitation. I leaned down, picking the book up and placing it back on her desk. She took no notice. "Well, if that's how we're gonna play it," I smiled, trying to look playful, but really just making sure to hide my nervousness. I bundled all the strings attached to her together with one hand and pulled them all free. She blinked, turning to stare at me. "Holy crap, Martin. You're like a ninja or something." "I've been sitting here for maybe 10 minutes, I smiled, relieved my friend had finally noticed me. "Where'd all these strings come from?" she gasped, seemingly noticing them for the first time too. "I assumed you were all screwing with me." She stood up, backing into a corner. No one else in the class noticed. "They weren't here a minute ago. Do you see them too?" Her tone made it clear she was genuinely scared. "No, didn't you?" I was interrupted by my teacher slamming the door behind her. Everyone except me and Lucy murmured a good morning, and still, no one seemed to pay any attention to either of us. "People have been ignoring me all day," I said to Lucy, before turning to our teacher. "Hey you! You can't teach!" No reaction. I'm getting away from all this. Lucy pulled a few strings aside and left the class. I followed, and surprise, surprise, no one else noticed. We wandered the corridors, leaving and entering classes as we saw fit. Whenever we untied a chair or a book from someone else, it was like they suddenly didn't really matter to them. It didn't exist. I showed her the street outside. There were more strings than when I came in this morning, twice as many. We carefully picked our way through the tangle, making our way to a nearby coffee shop. Not particularly grand, I know, but what would you do in our situation? As I said, fear of the unknown sometimes seems like the safer option. On a few occasions, I suggested we untie a few more people. Lucy was opposed, remembering how terrified she had been. In the coffee shop, we grabbed a couple of sandwiches and drinks from the fridge. We found a table, untied all the strings attached to the chairs, and sat down. We both ate in silence, both of us too scared, trying to distract ourselves by watching the strangers in the shop, oblivious to the strings. After 20 minutes, Lucy spoke up. "Now she's going to take that sandwich," she said, pointing at a woman across the shop. Sure enough, she walked to the fridge and took the plastic-wrapped sandwich she was tied to. "She pays for it and leaves." She did so, according to the prophecies of the strings. That guy doesn't intend to pay. I watched as a man took his coffee and ran out the door, the two servers just looking too exasperated to go after him. "This is horrible," she whimpered. "Let's go, please." Outside wasn't much better. Everyone just followed the strings' instructions, going about their daily lives. Lucy announced she was going home to sleep this off, and I agreed to walk her home. She only lived 10 minutes away. Away from the busier part of town, there were fewer strings. It was nicer. We could pretend it wasn't happening. When we turned onto Lucy's street, she stopped, her mouth falling open. "What now?" I broke the silence, my voice sounding surprisingly small. "Look." She pointed outside one of her neighbor's houses. I saw it clearly. And I'll take that memory of that moment till the day I die. A little dark imp, maybe 3 feet tall, walking along with its knuckles on the ground, almost like a monkey. It had 2 bulbous yellow eyes taking up about half its face, and no mouth or any other facial features. It was holding a hammer and a ball of twine, which it was letting out behind it. It walked quickly and quietly from the front door of the house to the mailbox. It stopped, hammered a nail into the side of the box, and tied its string around it. It turned to face us, and stopped when it spotted us. My bottom fell out even further than it had already been. It just stared with a look of surprise and curiosity. You could say it was more frightened. Suddenly, it beckoned us with its tiny hand. I looked at Lucy. She hadn't moved. I looked back at the imp, which stared at me. I halved the distance between us, and then halved it again. This wasn't the fear of the unknown anymore. It was just fear of this little guy. It didn't seem like anything to be scared of. When I was a meter away, it extended its hand. Hi. I shook it. It nodded in approval, blinking its massive yellow eyes up at me. So, you're the one in charge of the strings? It nodded eagerly. I called Lucy over, but she stayed where she was. Are there more of you? Another nod. I wanted to ask it so many questions about what it was and where it came from, but it seemed for now I was stuck with only yes or no questions. Do we even have free will? It just looked at me, almost sadly. I immediately felt sick to my stomach and couldn't bear looking at the little monster anymore. I grabbed Lucy, who had been listening to our exchange, and now sat on the curb with her, head in her hands. Come on. We entered her house. I made a cup of tea. When I found her in the living room, she had untied her dog and was curled up with it, crying. I set the tea down and sat beside her. I'm so scared, she whispered, after a good 10 minutes of sobbing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I'm going to sleep, she mumbled suddenly. It was under within a minute. Sleep was starting to sound pretty good all of a sudden. My eyelids suddenly felt like they were being weighed down. I collapsed to the rug, and the last thing I heard before I fell asleep was the scurrying of several sets of little feet nearby. I felt much better the next day, as if the whole affair had been a dream. I'd probably have believed it if I hadn't been awoken by Lucy's mother that morning, wondering what I was doing sleeping over without permission or something. Over breakfast, Lucy asked me why I looked so pale and nervous. I turned to her and smiled, mumbling something to her about feeling sick. But the truth was, I was scared because I couldn't see any of the strings, and wondering whether my actions were truly my own. I leaned back, appreciating the handiwork of the birdhouse I had quite literally placed the last nail into. My eyes, squinting into the late October glow of an orange-yellow sunset, followed the horizon to the apple tree planted directly out front of my farmhouse. I spit one leftover nail onto the wooden porch deck as I meandered down the front steps and over to the broad tree, draping the birdhouse on one of its branches. You'd never know it was an apple tree unless I pointed it out. The poor thing had been barren for months, and I feared one more harsh winter would be the end of it. It was sometimes a painful memory to look at that tree. My late wife, Marge, and I planted it decades ago. We'd always pick the freshest fruit from it, picnic in the shadow of its branches, and enjoy some of her sweet apple pies. She always made the best pies. But now the tree was dying. I had neglected it, and the rest of my land followed suit. Everything was dying. If truth be told, the only critters that wouldn't die out here were the damn rats. As hard as I tried, no matter how much rat poison and sugar I sprinkled on the porch, they wouldn't go away. Eventually, I just gave up on them. I had lost most of my motivation after Marge passed, and this lack of care extended beyond the crops and trees. I hadn't shaved in weeks, and half the time I didn't bother to shower. It was just me out here, after all. The silence in place of her laughter and the rattling of her pots and pans was deafening. Despite my somewhat gruff appearance, it was the people of Francis, the town I had lived in basically my entire life, that kept me going. It wasn't a large town by any means, but the people here have always been some of the kindest folk around. Without their support, I probably wouldn't have made it through Marge's death. The only other company I kept was with the scarecrow out front. Marge used to call him Roy, probably because we used to listen to Roy Rogers on the radio every night. Roy's been standing in the same spot for the past 7 years, and I think most of the crows have already caught on to my Straw Man trick. Roy's been standing in the same spot for the past 7 years, and I think most of the crows have already caught on to my straw man trick. That's why, last week, I decided to build the birdhouse, hoping to lure in some robin or finches to drive the crows away. It was sad. It seemed that even Roy was dying too. After I had fed the cattle and watered my garden, I decided to call it a night. Despite the festivities elsewhere, you'd be hard-pressed to find even one trick-or-treater in these parts. I skipped dinner, as I sometimes do, and began to head to the bedroom, stopping into the kitchen for a cup of tea and to click the light off. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, didn't. Roy wasn't in his usual perching spot. The cross was still standing, but the scarecrow was nowhere to be seen. I shuffled over to the window for a closer look, assuming the blasted thing had just fallen due to the wind, but didn't see it anywhere. Then there was a knock at the door. I was hesitant at first. Who in their right mind would have come here at 9:30 at night? Surely no kids from the town. I doubt there even are any kids in this town. "Who is it?" I said, pressing my ear against the wooden door. No response. "Look, I don't want any trouble. If there's some kids out there, you best be heading home. I don't have any candies. Sorry." Nothing. Then the knocking came again. It was louder this time. Finally, and frustratedly, I pulled open the door with a squeak, and standing in the doorway was Roy. He was standing all by his lonesome, a dead look still in the buttons he donned his eyes. Beneath his sack-covered face, a faint mumbling pushed through the fabric. I fumbled back in shock and watched as the scarecrow dragged itself into my house. I would have said something to it, but no words choked from my lips, which were now dry and quivering. As the scarecrow flopped into the kitchen, I could hear the rattling of drawers and bowls, some crashing onto the floor, before a voice echoed from behind the wall. "Ah, much better," it said in a relieved, raspy tone as the muffled hobbling sound of straw-filled legs pattering across the wooden flooring approached the doorway. In stepped the scarecrow, the stitching on its mouth now cut open by one of Marge's kitchen knives. Its mouth was formed into some sort of smile. As it stepped closer, I stepped away. "I thought this would be a more familiar and more comfortable form to approach you with, Peter." The thing read me like a book with those black button eyes. It could tell I was panicked. "There's no need to be afraid, but I guess this form was a bit anomalous. Hindsight is always 20/20, so please forgive me if I startled you." The scarecrow hobbled back into the kitchen, and after but a moment, a familiar face emerged holding a cup of tea. I must have cried before becoming hostilely angry. It was Marge. I recognized her the instant we locked eyes. Something within me brought me to tears, but I hastily snapped from my loving gaze, wiping a tear from my face. That wasn't my wife. "You aren't my wife," I sternly said. Whatever was wearing my wife's face couldn't hide its regret, now plastered across it. "Oh, that's just great. I always try to keep from scaring people, but it seems in my efforts I always become more frightening," it said in my wife's voice. "You humans are a complex breed." My wife's face began to rot, her flesh slipping off the bone. Her eyes started sinking back into her skull before her clothes were drained of all color, eventually turning black as the night sky. Her now black garment flowed longer, and eventually it touched the ground. Her hands dried up around the cup of tea, leaving nothing but bone behind. And that's when the true nature of the presence made itself known. It was the Reaper. My back hit the wall as I shook in my boots. I didn't believe that this thing even existed, but here it was, standing in my living room. It was difficult to get a good look at it, but it was the Reaper. A skeleton, shrouded in a dark robe, now holding a scythe that touched the ground. I tried to make eye contact with it, at least where eyes should be, but even looking at the face of death played painful tricks in my head, which was already throbbing in its presence. "Forgive me, mine child. Thou mayst find it most difficult to looketh upon this form. I mean not frighten thou, but now as thou conceeth, I am thou he called death." The figure's voice was deep, rattling my bones and echoing in my mind. It must have noticed my discomfort, as my back was still firmly pressed against the wall. "I has taken many forms over the millennia, but thou humans seem to recognize me as the Reaper, and as he I appear before thou now." The empty socketed skull disappeared into the shroud, and within an instant, a new face emerged. A somewhat pudgy, pale, middle-aged man, lowering the black hood with meaty, hairy arms. "Sorry," he said. "I can only appear as that which is dead, as is my nature. The dead grass in your scarecrow worked quite well, as did your late wife, but those seemed most burdensome to you." "You don't say," I sarcastically grunted, letting out a nervous breath with a wipe across my damp forehead. "Hopefully this form is more palatable to you," he said, handing me the cup of tea as I shuddered. "This face was that of a 37-year-old by the name of Jim Johnson. Jim was a risk analyst. You know, those guys that do background checks before you get insurance. Funny enough, poor Jimmy died because he failed to background check his own girlfriend, a somewhat sociopathic little lady with a background including battery and grand larceny, both of those charges from a previous relationship where she mutilated her ex-boyfriend after overhearing him talking to his sister." He stopped, noting I wasn't listening due to my trembling. My eyes were constantly shifting to the front door. "Forgive my rambling. I do love a good irony. Now, on to why I'm here." "Why did you take Marge?" I grunted, puffing my chest, even though I knew this Reaper was in no way intimidated by me. It was silent for a moment, probably grasping at straws within its head. "There are things that are beyond that which man should know. Why the sun rises and sets, why the birds fly in the heavens, why the Reaper must harvest the living. Your wife was but one of many taken that day. 155,142 to be precise. Her death was not personal, I assure you, but rather part of a bigger plan. That which neither you nor I can see. My only purpose is to collect those who have been selected, harvest the ripened crops. How the wheat is separated from the chaff is not my duty, nor is it my duty to select or ripen the crops." "But you took her. You could have let her live." "No," it spoke. "I cannot tamper with the harvest. Many have tried to interfere, but their efforts were in vain." "How?" I said. The pudgy man's face, or whatever was underneath it, dryly chuckled to itself. "You humans are so strange with your fascinations and celebrations. Tonight, for example, has always been somewhat of an honorary birthday for me, I suppose." "It's your birthday?" I asked. Confusion now spread across my face as I took a sip from the cup. "Heavens, no. But surely if they can celebrate the birth of the Nazarene in December, they can observe my presence in October." "Your presence?" "Halloween, as you call it, has always been about me. Humans love to test that which they do not understand. Before your generation, the Samhain was offered up as a night to me. Some even thought they could bribe the Reaper, offering their livestock, their children, to stop the harvest." The Reaper shook its lowered head. "So, what do you want?" I said. "Are you going to kill me?" The Reaper laughed again, deeper this time. "You would think that, wouldn't you? After all, why else would the Grim Reaper come knocking at your door?" I stared like a deer in the headlights of death. It continued to laugh, this time at me. "Forgive me, Peter. As I said, I love a good irony." The Reaper glided past me, forcing my back into the wall. As it stopped before the window, it peered outside. How ironic would it be that a man surrounded by so much death could offer up a tremendous amount of life? "Who, me?" I said, surprised. It nodded as its back turned. "Who, me?" I said, surprised. It nodded as it turned back towards me. "Marge's poor apple tree," it said, shaking its head. "It's withered and dying, just like you. I suppose I could have harvested you tonight, but that wasn't my intention. I'm here to spare a lot of people through you, Peter." "I don't understand," I muttered, gripping the wooden table in the corner of the room. The Reaper glided closer to me until it noticed my trembling. "If I wouldn't have come here tonight, what would have happened?" I shook my head in confusion, lifting the cup of sour tea to my dry lips, taking a sip. "You would have gone to bed, probably for but a few small hours, before waking in a hot sweat. You would have poured yourself your nightly tea and stepped out onto the porch, but you would have forgotten the nail you spat onto it, remember?" The Reaper raised a now skeletal hand, pinching the nail I had clenched in my mouth an hour or so earlier. "You would have stepped on this. It would have hurt like hell, but you wouldn't have gone to the doctor, would you have?" I began to contemplate the scenario in my mind. "Of course you wouldn't have, Peter." The Reaper pointed to my scruffy, unkempt face. "You stopped caring about yourself the day Marge couldn't anymore, so why start?" My brows furrowed at the Reaper in confusion. It could tell I wasn't grasping its hypothetical story. "Forgive my ramblings. I assure you this all has a point." "Get to it," I said sternly. "If you would have stayed home, which you would have, the infection from the nail would have killed you, Peter." "What?" I said, brows furrowed. "Well, not initially, but after 3 weeks you would have suffered from enough severe tetanus that you would have died. Mostly extreme muscle spasming in the neck and mouth. They call it lockjaw." "Wait, are you saying this would have happened?" I sputtered. "Well, it's rare, but in your case, yes." "And you can see that?" The figure laughed at me in a condescending tone. "I am death. I can see all possible outcomes of mortality, so I can plan accordingly for the harvest." "So, I would have died if you hadn't come here tonight?" It laughed again, this time more of an ironic chuckle. "As a matter of fact, my being here tonight has saved more than just you." I swallowed down a cough before sitting down in an old squeaky wooden chair, resting the cup of tea on a nearby table. "See, if you would have died, Peter, you wouldn't have been able to send that little letter of yours." "What letter?" I barked, leaning forward with a creak. Oh, don't be coy. Second drawer down in the kitchen, tell me you didn't forget. I stood up, still trembling, and speedily tread into the kitchen, yanking the second drawer open. He was right. My letter to Dr. Farrow was resting atop some old cookbooks. I'd forgotten I had written the damn thing in the first place. He needs it, Death said, his voice echoing from the living room. Sometimes it's remarkable what a mere scribble of good tidings can do for the soul. I paced back into the kitchen, still clutching the letter in my hand. After what happened to Marge, Keith, Dr. Farrow, felt he wasn't an adequate medical doctor. 5 years in medical school and 12 years of practicing for what? This wouldn't have been the first time I had harvested one of his patients either. No, he's knocked on my door many times. But this time it finally dawned on him. It was as if what his father used to say was finally spoken into existence. Which was what? I said, now grasping at straws myself. Which was that Keith would never amount to anything. Sure, a degree gets you the title, but what good is that without natural-born talent? At least that's what his father would say. I glanced down at the letter, reading the sorrowful etching of his name on the envelope. He would have knocked at my door one final time. Personally, that is. Such a shame, suicide. Out of anyone in the world, including myself, to harvest you, to be your own Grim Reaper, is another form of sorrow beyond that which most understand. You're saying he would have killed himself if I didn't send that letter? I said, the letter clasped between my sweaty fingers. More or less. The universe works in a very cause and effect way. For example, if you would have died, you wouldn't have sent the letter. And if Dr. Farrow wouldn't have received that letter, he wouldn't have killed himself. And if he wouldn't have committed suicide, his brother would have missed his second tour in the Navy for the funeral. And if that would have happened, Admiral Keaton would have died, because Lieutenant Farrow wouldn't have been there to see that torpedo bomber. Wait, I said. What are you going on about? Cause and effect, Peter. Like dominoes or It's a Wonderful Life. You've seen that film, haven't you? I nodded. I know you have, Death said. You and Marge used to watch that every Christmas Eve. Death paused, looking at me, forcing my eyes to the wooden floor. Did you know that movie almost didn't happen? I mean, everybody loves Jimmy Stewart, but if it wasn't for him quitting the Air Force, he wouldn't have made all those films. He would have died? Death nodded in response. You'd be amazed at what a small harvest can do. Even just the death of one person. Like Marge's step-uncle, Harry. If he hadn't been harvested 2 days before she was supposed to leave for the University of Utah, she would have never been in that post office the day you two met. Love at first sight, I take it? That was a coincidence, I said. I caught her on the way out. I was... No, the voice of Death interrupted. There are no coincidences. You were running late because of your truck. It stalled out on State Road 32. You couldn't get it repaired the day You couldn't get it repaired that day because Louie, your mechanic, had a family emergency, remember? His niece suffered a stroke that morning, which meant you had to take the trek to the post office on foot. And those extra 14 minutes gave Margaret the time to catch you on the way out. Death drummed his fingers along the dusty windowsill, wiping the dust from the tips of his flesh-covered fingers. If death results in any action or reaction, I can see it. Something as simple as missing the bus could result in another world war, and trust me, you don't want to know how close your species has come to that. I rubbed my hair-speckled chin with my free hand, trying to sift through everything Death had told me. Dear Dr. Farrow, Death began. These last few months have been nothing but desperation without my Margaret. Somehow, I keep on living knowing she's in a better place. She would have wanted me to thank you, not for anything else but trying. You gave us hope. That's enough, I snapped, wiping another tear from my red face, letting out a dry cough and dampening it with tea. death slowly glided toward me. I hadn't the energy to recoil in fear any longer. He bent down and kneeled before me. Without you, your letter, your world would have been thrust into the biggest, most bountiful harvest ever. Ever. What do you mean? I whispered under my breath. Let's just say Admiral Keaton needs to live. Without Lieutenant Farrow to protect him, he would have died. And Farrow wouldn't have been on tour with a funeral to attend. A funeral that only you could have stopped, Peter. You and that letter of yours. I looked down at the somewhat crinkled letter, then back up at Death. As much as it throbbed, somehow what he said finally made sense in my mind. That is, of course, if you'd be alive to deliver it. I froze, confused by a tingling sensation in my neck on account of the Reaper's changing tone. What are you getting at? The Reaper chuckled to itself. This time it was a laugh of malice. Cause and effect, Peter. I stood, my knees buckling as I let out an exasperated cough. You said you came here to save me. Save more than me. About that, Death grinned. I lied. I stopped myself from stepping any further, my knees jittering. I braced myself for another cough, peering at the Reaper through watery eyes. But the nail... You said if I stepped on it, I was just pulling stuff out of my ass. Pete, come on. Do you really think the Grim Reaper would want to help people? Please. And to think I was nervous about my impression. Impression? I coughed. The Reaper, rolling up its cloak sleeves, revealed a darkly tinted suit beneath as it grinned at me through now polished teeth. Yeah, did you like it? He gleamed. I'm going for that old English feeling, like the King James. Gotta stay in character while sporting your Halloween costume, huh? What are you talking about? I choked. Do I have to spell it out for you? He groaned, rolling his eyes. You get the honor of spending Halloween with the Prince of the Power of the Air, the Father of Lies, and you can't even bother to keep up? Shame on you, man. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. I could sense he was approaching. The clicking of polished shoes making their way across the wooden flooring. I could hear him laughing, the bellowing voice of the Reaper now replaced with a smooth, confident tone. I lifted my head, but with one cough, I dropped to the floor, spattering blood from between my teeth. Peter, you really shouldn't be leaving your rat poison out in the kitchen. Marge always warned you of these things. You never know when some clever, handsome little devil might, I don't know, pour some in your nightly tea. I spit more blood, mixed with the bubbling of foam, from my mouth onto the floor. The letter, wedged between my convulsing fingers, was yanked from my hand. I could hear it being torn open. Where was I? Oh yeah, his voice said. You gave us hope. And I know one day I'll see my blessed bride again. Sincerely, Peter. The voice cackled. I've got good news for you, Pete. You're about to get your wish. After all, it's Halloween. Why not have a little treat with your trick? I lifted my head with the remainder of my strength. In the shadow of the glowing moonlight cast from the window, I could see a figure standing over me, adorned with horns in a proud posture. My head fell against the cold wooden flooring as I tried to cry out for someone, anyone. I knew no one could hear me. With a final breath, just as the moonlight turned to blackness, I could hear one final message from the visitor. A sly wink within his voice. Happy Halloween, Peter.